I'll try to address a few of those. In terms of lawsuits in the U.S. against Israeli officials, the U.S. does not have the concept of universal jurisdiction. So the U.S. Does not attempt to allow its courts to prosecute crimes that occur elsewhere. Other more enlightened places do, and I'm using that term kind of facetiously. But for example, the UK does have universal jurisdiction. Spain does. That's how Pinochet was arrested, and so on. I'm aware of at least one incident where an Israeli official canceled a visit to the UK because they were afraid they may be arrested. But whether there's an ongoing lawsuit, I don't know the answer to that. In terms of what I was saying about the difference between having guns pointed at me as I go to school, that's not to say that there is not violence or oppression here. My point is just that just because I don't have the same level of violence at me personally does not mean that I cannot be in solidarity with somebody. But in that solidarity, I have to recognize that me personally, I'm not subject to checkpoints. I'm not seeing my father's land cut in two and then cut into three by a wall, right? So the point of that is that my being in solidarity with somebody does not only occur on the basis of something I can necessarily relate to, something that has happened in my life, but rather is based on the fact that they are going through injustice, just as I may be going through other injustices in my own life. In terms of Iran's solidarity with Palestine or their place, I'm not really sure that that's a question that I can answer. I think that's a question that more people that are more directly involved in the ways in which Iran has volunteered its services for the Palestinian people would be able to answer. But I don't know, maybe somebody else has something. NGOs that do not have the NGO industrial complex, NGO problem, I think that there are a number of organizations that have been created at the grassroots level in Palestine. And if you're talking about the Middle East in particular, there are lots of organizations that, with what limited resources they have, are grassroots based, are doing amazing work in wherever they are based. At the same time, it's very difficult to be an internationally funded NGO and not buy into the NGOization system. However, there are people that work within these NGOs that are amazing and that are doing amazing work, but they also do recognize that they're participating in a system that is not the ultimate way for liberation, right? So I think it's a structural problem as opposed to like a individual NGO problem. It's more structural, and that makes it really difficult to figure out a criteria by which to judge. I think anytime you're working for an NGO, at least in Palestine, you're selling your soul a little bit to the NGOization system. Now, whether that's worth the work you're doing, that's a question that's up to each individual. And lastly, in terms of what should people in the U.S. do to support Palestinian Philippines, I'm going to answer like completely succinctly, but I think that in terms of Palestine, there is a clear call from civil society in Palestine. We need to work for boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. And I think that's not the most we can do, that's the least we can do, right? That's the starting point. There's a whole lot more that needs to happen. But given that there is such a clear call for that, I think that's a starting point for all of us here.
I'm just going to answer two of the questions because I think my colleagues answered the others very well. On the issue of Iran, first of all, the vilifying of Iran and Iran's connections to Hezbollah and Hamas and so on, I think a lot of it is to delegitimize resistance. So if money is coming from Iran, then this resistance that you're trying to fight against occupation, against oppressive policies, let's not focus on that anymore. That's not right because it's coming from Iran, which is a bad country. This is what Western media usually makes us believe. Iran has its problems, but that's for the Iranian people, not for us to come in and decide for them. At the same time, I think there's obviously the dynamics of oil corporations. I don't know if you guys seen some of the WikiLeaks that are out. It's the Gulf states, oil-rich nations, wanting to push the U.S. to bomb Iran. Let's start this war. A lot of this is influence in the region, number one. We are the major power players, the Gulf states, in the region, and we are the major power players when it comes to oil corporations. But again, it's attempting to delegitimize the resistance movements that are going on, and at the same time, takes our focus away from resistance. And I think Iran and another country, when it comes to flotilla and solidarity movements into Gaza and breaking the siege, Turkey, I think both countries are trying to be a major power player in the Middle East. But one thing that bothers me is, especially with Turkey, is it's important and it's great that we're getting the support from a government, but at the same time, the government of Turkey is not innocent in and of itself in human rights abuses. I mean, the minimum, they haven't recognized Armenian genocide. And that's extremely important to bring up. So we can't just hold these countries up on a pedestal and say they're supporting our resistance and completely deny or not look at the human rights abuses within their own country. Of course, the Kurds as well. And the second question, I thought that was really a question on NGOs. To me, the ideal NGO, or nonprofit, or a grassroots organization, is the one that puts the needs of the oppressed above the needs of the donors. That's the ideal one to me, and I feel like they're not functioning that way. And a lot of folks that have been quit and left a lot of these organizations because the needs of the donors were put first. The needs of the board was put first. And of course, they have to be justice-centered. And I think the rest answers the question.
I just said I wanted to make a couple comments on the NGOs. I'm not supposed to, but I want to. Actually, I think it's important to comment because recently a few colleagues and myself got into a real discussion about the NGOization and the role of NGOs in Palestine. There was really some disagreements in terms of NGO bashing. A lot of the NGOs in Palestine are doing really important grassroots work, mobilizing work, empowerment work, and I think that that's something that's important to know. But I think that there's three main things in which we can pinpoint the flaws of the NGOs. Some of them have been discussed today, which is the conditional money, right? The conditional money that comes from donors, international funders, the aid dependency, which you guys all spoke of. The second one is that in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is the #1 employer of the Palestinians. The second employer of Palestinians is the NGO nonprofit system. And as a result, that's who's feeding families at the end of the day. And so a lot of people say this is killing our time and our commitment and our priorities to national liberation, and we're operating within the model of a post-colonial state or a post-colonial conflict building our civil society infrastructure as opposed to us really having a realization that we are still within a national liberation project. But more importantly, and I think something that in a way that we can connect it and really understand it, is to think of NGOs in this country. The NGOs in Palestine are extraordinarily comparable to NGOs in the United States. Why? Because they, in many ways, they take the position of what should be state services. They take the position of what the government should provide for us, what health and education and youth empowerment and women's empowerment. Those are things that should be provided by our state sector. And as a response of alleviating the state from that, they're being sort of funneled into the NGO process. And so then people, our governments and the elite can say, oh, we gave our donation at the end of the year, we're not responsible for paying any more taxes because we donated to the nonprofit sector. But at the end of the day, that money, I mean, if you really think of the amount of humanitarian and nonprofit money that's being dumped into Palestinian organizing in the West Bank and Gaza, because of the current economic situation, it completely gets flushed into the Israeli economy and actually benefits the Israeli economy. So the state services that Israel was once responsible for providing prior to Oslo, when they were occupying power, and under the Fourth Geneva Convention, they were responsible for paying for education and health and roads and all these things for the Palestinian people. Post-Oslo, we're no longer responsible for it, and therefore the international community, through NGOs, became responsible for doing so. So this is something that really we need to think of, that NGOs are good as long as they support the steadfastness of the people on the ground, as long as we can provide them with clean water to drink and food at the end of the day, but not to dilute or to convolute the situation as being post-conflict or post-colonial. We're still under a foreign settler colonial regime, as are most places in the world, including the Philippines. So this is definitely something that we need to think of when we think of the relationship between states and NGOs.
There was one point that was brought up, Jaime, that you brought up and you forgot to touch on, is the issue of Arizona and anti-immigration laws in Arizona, and it's going on across the nation. One of the speakers who wasn't able to come because she got into an accident is from the Chicano community. And who better of an ally than the Chicano Latino communities in the United States and indigenous communities in the United States who know what settler colonialism feels like. So definitely that is in our mindset and in the mindset of international solidarity across all our groups. So yes, it's definitely there, even though we didn't talk about it.
I think the one thing I wanted to add about NGOs in terms of Palestine is that the NGOs have created a new class in Palestine. And particularly, it's not just the money that should have been used to fund those services coming from Israel as an occupying power, but it's also the employees of NGOs, especially internationals who have the freedom to travel into Israel proper, who are spending that money primarily in the Israeli economy. Part of the distaste for many the distaste of many grassroots organizers for NGOization is seeing foreign workers coming in, being paid to do work, and then spending that money in nightclubs in Tel Aviv, or well, it's different spending than. I see what you mean. People living in Ramallah, being paid in Ramallah, going to Tel Aviv to spend their money. That's really common, and that is kind of what the international NGO employee does. And as a stereotype, I'm not saying everybody does that. So I think that although NGOs in Palestine have a lot of similarities to those in the US, I think the classism, and particularly the class of internationals created by the NGOization of the West Bank, has resulted in much more money and much more benefit to Israel than it has to the Palestinian people.
Guys, are there any questions from the virtual world? Any questions?
No.